channel the discussion, an objective and impartial view of the issues of interest to you. Nation Beat is on now.
Welcome to the Cannabis Task Force panel discussion. I am Reniata D'Souza and I will be your moderator today. I want to introduce to you the Vice Chairperson of the Cannabis Task Force, Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis, and also the PRO, Mr. Vern Emmanuel. I will be handing over to Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis to begin the proceedings with a brief remark.
Thank you for that, Ms. D'Souza. Permit me, if I may, to go through a few points regarding the current status of cannabis and the proposed regime for cannabis. The status quo. The law regarding cannabis as it stands today, 1, permits a person to possess 30 grams of cannabis on his person. 2, permits small-scale cultivation of 4 plants in a household in certain circumstances, and notwithstanding the 2 earlier provisions, prohibits smoking in public. Possession of in excess of 30 grams of cannabis remains an offense. Cultivation of more than 4 plants is in breach of the parameters of cultivation remains an offense, and smoking in public also remains an offense. By way of overview of the proposed regime, the government of St. Lucia and people of St. Lucia have and continue to have due regard for a number of international conventions, which include those related to cannabis and narcotics. The decisions of the international bodies regarding cannabis has also been pertinent in the minds of the task force. In order to maintain the functional international trade relationships which we have, our much needed access to international banking lines, and the most important oversight of the parameters of our health and safety, St. Lucia is compelled to be quite deliberate in redrawing the line in the sand regarding cannabis. Based on the decisions of the International Narcotics Control Board, or INCB, and pursuant to the Single Convention on Narcotics, cannabis may only be developed for medicinal use, industrial use, or for scientific research purposes. The intent for cannabis in St. Lucia is to fall under these headings as mandated. This point is worth reiteration. Based on international restrictions espoused by treaty and accepted international stances, our commercial cannabis regime in St. Lucia may only be permitted for medicinal, industrial, and scientific purposes. Recreational cannabis use is not permitted under these parameters as set by the INCB. In the view of the INCB, sacramental use is seen as recreational use and would thusly not be permitted for commercial cannabis regimes. The legal possession of cannabis of up to 4 plants per household is allowed for consumption under the new regime. All consumption shall take place within a private place, and for the purpose of cannabis legislation, all Rastafarian places of worship shall be deemed a private place. Small-scale cultivation farmers will be eligible to apply for and be issued a traditional cultivation license, which will allow for up to 3 acres to be cultivated in St. Lucia. Non-nationals and larger cultivators who may apply for up to 10 licenses, ranging from plantation licenses for medicinal and industrial cannabis. Licenses will also be required for activities such as manufacturing, transportation, importation, exportation, dispensing, research, and others. Permit me to go into the parameters regarding purchase and use of cannabis. Non-industrial cannabis, for these purposes referred to generally as medicinal cannabis, is being sold under 2 headings: Class 1 and Class 2 medicinal cannabis. Class 1 medicinal cannabis shall be cannabis products which are strictly CBD products, or cannabis products which otherwise fall below a prescribed THC threshold. Class 2 medicinal cannabis shall be medicinal cannabis products which surpass the prescribed THC threshold. Class 2 medicinal cannabis products will require a prescription and will only be sold at Class 2 dispensaries, whereas Class 1 medicinal cannabis may be purchased without prescription from Class 1 or Class 2 medicinal cannabis dispensaries. A person who is of the view that they suffer from a qualifying illness may visit a Class 1 medicinal cannabis dispensary and self-prescribe a Class 1 medicinal cannabis product to treat that qualifying illness. A person who suffers from a qualifying illness for which Class 1 cannabis products are insufficient or ineffective may visit a qualified medical practitioner who has obtained a valid prescription authorization certificate and obtain a prescription for Class 2 medicinal cannabis. A patient in possession of Class 2 medicinal cannabis must at all times be in possession of the prescription giving rise to possession or the license issued by virtue of that possession. The proposed legislation will create an entity to be called the Controlled Substances Regulatory Authority, which shall issue and oversee the industry. There shall also be a Medical Cannabis Advisory Council, which shall advise the Minister and the CSRA on matters regarding cannabis. There shall be no more than 2 licensed central trading or distribution entities. After cultivation, all cannabis for local consumption shall be sold to one of these central entities or receive approval to bypass the entity in cases where a cultivator has a license for manufacturing, exportation, etc. All dispensaries shall purchase cannabis from the central entity unless imported. Prohibitions. It shall be a ticketable offense to consume cannabis in a public place. A person may be permitted to possess 30 grams or less of Class 1 medicinal cannabis on his person, and it shall be a ticketable offense to be in possession of more than 30 grams of cannabis, that is Class 1, or to be in possession of Class 2 cannabis without a prescription. A person may be permitted to possess such amounts of Class 2 medicinal cannabis on his person as duly prescribed to him by a qualified medical practitioner who is the holder of a valid prescription authorization certificate. It shall be an offense to be in possession of Class 2 medicinal cannabis without the requisite prescription and authorization. It shall be an offense to cultivate, import, export, process, transport, manufacture, test, carry research on, prescribe, dispense, or otherwise retail cannabis or cannabis products without a license issued by the CSRA. It shall be an offense to operate a vehicle or heavy machinery as well while under the influence of cannabis. With regard to minors, any use of cannabis by a minor shall be pursuant to a prescription issued by a qualified medical practitioner who has been issued with a valid prescription authorization certificate. It shall be an offense to give cannabis or cannabis products to a minor unless a prescription has been obtained for that minor. Minors who are found to be using cannabis without a prescription may be ordered to participate in controlled substance workshop, seminars, or in community service. This is a summary of the cannabis regime which has been proposed by the St. Lucia Cannabis Task Force and received endorsement by the Cabinet of Ministers. It has informed the legislation which is currently being drafted, which has almost been completed, and will be the framework for the regime going forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis. We are now going to move on to our PRO, Mr. Vern Emmanuel, for his opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. The next steps, as outlined by Mr. Inglis in his presentation of the draft framework, will see the movement of a public consultation on the draft bill once we receive the requisite approvals for its content, and concurrent with that we will see public comment on proposed cannabis standards by the St. Lucia Bureau of Standards. Effective the 1st of March, we will have through our standards comment portal the proposed new work items for cannabis standards in St. Lucia, which are primarily based on ASTM D37, which is the technical committee for cannabis. We envisage that these standards will assist in the public policy and the framework that has been articulated in the Controlled Substances Regulatory Authority Bill, and that the regulation of cannabis needs to occur in a manner which is compatible with our national interests and in keeping with our international obligations and the requisite treaties that we have signed on to. We believe that there is significant space for us to both comply with the international treaties while ensuring that we have a robust and economically viable and sustainable industry in St. Lucia, using the three areas of medicinal, industrial, and research.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vinny Manuel. We will now move on to the question portion of our panel. There are a few compiled questions, and then we'll be opening to the audience. Our first question, either of you may answer. Can you tell us what the legislation will be called?
The legislation as drafted is called the Controlled Substances Regulatory Authority Bill.
My second question was, what does CSRA stand for? But you just answered, Controlled Substances Regulatory Authority. So my third question, who will be on the regulatory board?
The regulatory board will consist of state agencies, primarily the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Commerce, the Police, Ministry of Labor, St. Lucia Bureau of Standards, Ministry of Agriculture, and other entities as nominated by the minister.
Thank you very much. My fourth question, what are the categories of cannabis that will form the medical cannabis industry?
Well, that has not been delineated. So what the legislation envisages or has the framework that there will be two categories. The specificity of what those thresholds are will be determined by the Medical Advisory Council, which will be formed as part of the legislation. So what there is a clear distinction is that Class 1 is distinct from Class 2. Class 1 may be as approved and would not require a prescription. Class 2 would require a prescription and a medical practitioner to issue that prescription and a licensed pharmacist and dispensary to dispense that medication. What we continue to have is to ensure that the public understands that the new regime for cannabis will be from a public health approach. It will not be a free-for-all. There will be the existing public health regulations will remain in place. The smoking of cannabis in public will be prohibited. The use of cannabis by minors will remain prohibited unless under specified medical guidance.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just to echo that sentiment, based on the provisions and based on the evolution of the cannabis industry internationally, we thought it prudent to ensure that the legislation did not specify a specific threshold in itself, but provided the medical advisory committee or council rather to advise the minister on the parameters which we understand may change from time to time. So it may in the initial stages be very low and have a need to be increased, or be too high and have a need to be lowered. So we thought it was more prudent to deal with a regulatory framework that would decide what the threshold would have been as opposed to putting it in the legislation.
Understood. Thank you very much. My next question is for you, Mr. Norbert Inglis. In your opening remarks, you mentioned licenses. So we would like to know, what are the types of licenses that will be available?
Okay, so as I spoke to earlier, there are going to be a number of cultivation licenses which deal with cultivation of medicinal cannabis and cultivation of industrial cannabis. They have been separated. There's also a classification of license which is specific to the traditional cultivators. So individuals who would have been part of the industry for the past years, who would have been part of the cannabis regime as it exists illegally. The intention was to ensure that these persons did have an avenue to become legitimate within the industry. And as such, the traditional cultivation license was created to facilitate these persons transitioning from the legitimate market into the legitimate market. Beyond that, every aspect dealing and concerning with cannabis is regulated. So the transportation will require a license. You would well understand the expectation is not for persons who have cultivated to have the product in the back of a pickup or in a vehicle transporting. There is going to be a need for robust security given the value of the product, and we thought it prudent to ensure that licensing regimes looked after that aspect of it, as well as the manufacturing, which would be subject to a number of standards and guidelines, the sale of it, whether it be class 1 or class 2, all of these parameters would have required licenses.
All right, so besides the traditional cultivation license, who else will be eligible to receive a cultivation license?
So the traditional cultivation license it requires that person to be what we refer to as a natural person. So these must be individuals. The other licenses do not so require. So you may have individuals or companies who wish to get involved in the industry, whether they be St. Lucian or not. They have the opportunity to apply for a license, and the CSRE board will make that determination.
Okay, thank you very much. My next question can be answered by either one of you. How will the cannabis industry provide mechanisms for effective access to St. Lucians who are interested in the economic benefits to be derived?
Touch on that one first.
All right. Well, part of the social safeguards which have been put in place are one, that the cultivator's license needs to be a natural person, and that was the only legal mechanism that we have at this point to ensure that the persons who may have traditionally participated in the growing of the product would be able to be an active participants in the new industry. We must also understand that in the new regulatory framework, we will also be operating in a free market. In the free market, the rules of competition will exist, and the rules of competition state that the market needs to be free, it needs to be fair, it needs to be undistorted. To the extent where regulations will distort the market, they need to fulfill a legitimate objective, being health, safety, national security. The industry is also framed in a manner that will allow for control in ensuring that we meet the international regulations. The international regulations require that the state must know and quantify the total amount of cannabis on island. And the only manner we can do that is through a licensing system. And there will be licenses all along the value chain. So there's a cultivator's license, there's a processor's license, there's a transportation license. There will be a clearinghouse, of which in the legislation it envisages a minimum of 2 clearinghouses, and the exact context of how that clearinghouse will be formulated is still under discussion, but it is envisaged that at least one of the clearinghouses may be a cooperative.
Okay. Anything to add, Mr. Norbert Inglis?
I think that was succinct.
Okay, thank you. All right, my next question, how soon will the legislation be enacted?
Well, the legislation will be put on our legislative agenda. We believe that it is a priority for the government to ensure that the cannabis industry is fit for its purpose. We can go quickly alone, but we can go further together. And we also have gone through a process to ensure that our cannabis industry in St. Lucia is also harmonized with our other OECS member states. So what we're doing in St. Lucia is distinct, it is different, it is not identical to what has been done in other OECS territories, but we are working to ensure that it is harmonized, and that harmonization means that it performs in the same manner, and it may not necessarily read in the same script, but the performance needs to be this identical.
Okay. My final question, what can cannabis consumers expect the industry to look like after everything has been put in place? Please take us through the ideal structure of the industry.
Okay. So, well, I would have touched on a number of these points in my preamble, but essentially, users of cannabis would have had to have accessed cannabis through one of two mechanisms. So if an individual wants to believes that they have a qualifying illness, which will be specified within the legislation, and they believe that cannabis would have been a product that could assist in the difficulties, the illness that they face, that individual can, if they fall within the threshold for class 1, self-prescribe, go to a class 1 dispensary and obtain a cannabis product which can treat that qualifying illness. If it is that the qualifying illness cannot be treated by class 1 cannabis, they will have to seek a prescription from a qualified medical practitioner who can then give them the parameters for the cannabis use, which would have been class 2 cannabis. And they can then go to a class 2 dispensary and obtain from the class 2 dispensary the prescribed cannabis that has been that they have been indicated, that has been indicated to them that they need to take in the same parameters as they have been prescribed to take it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis and Mr. Vini Manuel. I would like to open up questions from the audience.
Morning. Thank you, gentlemen, for answering the questions.
Morning.
As you probably well know, that we have an well-established black market and cannabis industry that has been off the books for many decades. Many of the people who have been involved in this industry have been marginalized because of their association, sometimes jails, families broken up, and have really suffered because of the draconian measures that we have taken to actually regulate cannabis. Many of these people don't have money, so what would be the procedure they would have to go through to continue their cannabis business? Like, they have fellas who sell weed on the corner, and they have guys who are producing weed, growing ganja on lands that are not their own. How do we get all these people to come on board, and what sort of prices, and how would they continue to apply their trade?
Well, part of the bill envisages an amnesty for traditional persons who have been participating in cannabis undeclared and illegally. It requires them to make a declaration in order that the budding industry will not be killed off in the route to getting the correct regulatory framework. We've also indicated that the cannabis reform requires a whole of society approach. It is not just one sector of society. So those marginalized persons need to, or citizens need to come forward. They need to make the requisite declarations under the CSRA bill's protection, and then be able to engage with the government and state authorities in order that we can assist them in becoming active economic persons in a regularized manner. They cannot continue to remain in their illegality, and they cannot continue to not be known. So the state cannot respond to you if it doesn't know you. Right? They must become known. Their circumstances must become known. And not because that they become known that we will immediately and automatically be able to address their specific issues. But you cannot create a mechanism or a path to solution if you do not properly articulate what the exact problem or where the gaps may be that need to be addressed. Because those gaps that, when we bring them into a regular context, they will now become economic actors. They will now, as an agricultural product, be asking for inputs factors to assist their means of production. They may require land, they may require fertilizers, they may require vehicles for transport, they may require permissions, permits, access to resources. They will also be required to not farm or have a production facility in a place which is incompatible to the industry. So they cannot farm near rivers in forested areas, affecting the water resource catchment areas. So these are things that we know exist. We know we've traditionally, if we want as a society, ignored or not been able to properly address in that. So the cannabis reform will also speak to items or issues like our land use policy and how we now classify lands, how we now convert lands from agricultural to other uses, and how we now allow persons to access concessions through the industry, but it must be in a permitted framework.
So there's an application process. So, for instance, a farmer who is on not or in forestry lands or on lands that would be dangerous to watersheds,
Right.
and he has been in the industry for a while. How does he prove it to you, and is there an application process, and are there going to be lands available for these people who have never had the opportunity to own lands but actually make a living by planting?
Well, these are the issues to be addressed, because you clearly would not be able to, if you have an area demarcated as a water catchment site or area, that you would not be able to provide him a permit in the catchment area. He would now have to get a permit in another area.
So is the government thinking of releasing certain lands for the industry and for these people who don't have lands? Because on an estimate, I'm sure more than half or maybe even a greater percentage of people farming cannabis on lands that are not their own. So this may be an issue that we would like. Is the government planning to release lands, or do you know that?
No, we cannot say definitively that the government is planning to release lands.
Lands available.
What we can say is that you can apply for permission to use Crown lands for agricultural purposes. That is distinct from us making a definitive statement that the government is planning to release lands for cannabis. Okay. You can apply for Crown lands for agricultural purposes, and that has an established process.
Okay. So just to echo that sentiment, farmers have for quite some time had the ability to apply for Crown lands to utilize for agricultural purposes. The difficulty has been that the industry, which was an illicit industry, did not permit a farmer to come to say that I would like to farm cannabis and would like to lease land from Crown lands to farm cannabis. When you have a legitimate industry, it now empowers the persons and actors within the industry to say that I would like to legitimately rent from Crown lands a property for cultivation. I would like to receive financing from an institution to inject capital into my business. I would like to get some concessionary assistance by way of imports for fertilizer, etc., for my business. And that is the intent of the legislation, so it can empower the current cultivators so that they can access some of the already existing benefits that farmers can benefit from.
Okay, so that's the farmer. So I'm assuming that once a farmer is interested, he would make himself known to the system and then as a result apply. I would say that generally from my experience, most of the farmers are farming under 3 acres. Nobody's farming a whole acre of cannabis. So the 3 acres, can more than one person grow on the 3 acres, or that 3 acres that you're talking about for the lowest tier, is only one applicant for the 3 acres, or can people kind of like 3 or 4
crop sharing.
people
Essentially, what you're
get
referring to
together.
the crop sharing. So the license that would have been granted for cultivation is specific to the individual. So an individual can indicate that I am cultivating cannabis on this piece of property. It need not necessarily be the whole 3 acres. Another farmer may similarly indicate that he wants to farm on the same block and parcel, but on a separate piece of it. So you can have a 3-acre lot that has been given by Crown Lands to a group, and 3 persons may apply for licenses to cultivate 1 acre each on that same lot. So that has been envisaged.
Okay. And where is the market? Suppose we have 500 farmers that apply, that get licensed and have the land, and say we have £1,000 per acre kind of yield. So we have 50,000 pounds of cannabis. Where are we going to sell the cannabis?
Well, we have 2 avenues to look at cannabis retail. One would have been the medicinal cannabis industry in St. Lucia. 2 would have been the industrial cannabis industry in St. Lucia. And we want to remind persons that cannabis need not only be seen as the medicinal cannabis or the high THC cannabis. There is quite a bit of scope for cannabis for industrial purposes, and we have seen in other jurisdictions a thrust towards industrial cannabis or hemp, and great benefits to the economy from that product, which prior to legalization, most persons did not have much of an interest in because of the restrictions that the industry had. So we are hoping that the industry does not limit itself to only medicinal cannabis or to class 2 medicinal cannabis, which would have been high THC cannabis, but also looks at the possibilities that exist with industrial cannabis, 1. And 2, beyond that, we look at the scope for exportation. We have had a number of persons approach the task force indicating an interest and an appetite to invest in cannabis for exportation to other markets. These individuals have been directed to Invest St. Lucia and the Ministry of Responsibility for Investment so that due diligence can be done. And the hope is that these persons can lend some support or provide some conduit for access to markets overseas, both for industrial cannabis and medicinal cannabis.
And then my last question. A lot of people use cannabis here and they access it from guys on the block who don't have a brick and mortar sort of facility to dispense the cannabis. How do you see the transition, or is there going to be a transition? Are there going to be requirements for these guys who've been plying their business on street corners for many years? How are we going to get them into the industry? Because we cannot legalize have an industry and then keep these guys out. These guys are the front runners, and we need to ensure that they are almost first in line because they suffered, and we don't think anybody should leapfrog because these guys will continue to ply their industry. So how do these, you talk about a dispensary. They don't have a dispensary yet. They are dispensers of cannabis. So how are we going to get them involved?
Well, I will let Mr. Emmanuel touch on that briefly, but before I do, I want to make sure that persons understand the parameters and standards for cannabis are not parameters and standards that we have on our own determined that we need. They have been set internationally, and we are compelled to apply them to our local regime. Not just because of health standards, but also because we want to continue to have the conduit to banking that we have internationally, and we want to continue to maintain a proper appreciation for what is happening from a health perspective on the island. Beyond that, there is a need for us, as much as we have opened up an industry, not to lower the standards of the industry, but to venerate the current players in the industry to meet a standard. So as opposed to saying to an individual, we will allow you to continue to apply in your current situation, which was the situation in the illicit industry, it is to seek some means of empowering these individuals so that they can be brought up to a standard that is workable given the requirements that we have internationally. So these individuals, as I said, are now in a position to benefit from all of the concessions that a farmer would be able to benefit from. And when you look at the persons who are selling cannabis now, they are in a position to benefit from any benefit that a business person or entrepreneur could benefit from. They legitimately can go to a bank and specify to a lending agency, I wish to get a loan for me to do X, involved in cannabis, and that is now a legitimate means of income. So it is to change the thinking that these persons have, that okay, well, I juggle cannabis, and it's no longer a juggling of cannabis. These persons are viable entrepreneurs and need to see themselves as such, and determine how, if it may be by coming together or otherwise, how they can raise their standard to a point that they can become the players that we intend to have as part of the industry. We do not intend to shun them or keep them away, and we'd like, and I believe the administration has indicated an interest and appetite in assisting them as much as is possible, whether that would be by means of grant funding, whether that be by means of facilities for them to utilize, I cannot say. That is for the administration to make the determination on, but I do know that there is some interest in ensuring that these persons are sought after, are taken care of, and their interests are sought after.
Yeah. So that is also envisaged in the retailer's license. So that person would be essentially be a retailer of type 1 or class 1 medicinal cannabis. What I would also want you to dispel the myth and disabuse our minds of the ability to juggle cannabis on a street. That is illegal now, and it will remain illegal. You will not be juggling cannabis on a street corner.
So is there, but they are doing it now. Is there going to be a transition period, so forgiveness period?
The framework that we have envisaged for them is to transition them into retailers with a retail license for class 1 medicinal cannabis. But the framework, the operation framework, will not be on a street corner. You will not be able to juggle cannabis on a street corner. That is not appropriate. It cannot be. It is incompatible with the regularized framework, and it is also incompatible with how we envisage the industry to run. As Dylan indicated, these persons must be seen not as jugglers or in an informal industry, but as entrepreneurs within a regularized framework. And the retailer's license will allow them to properly and actively participate in the industry. It is not there to restrict them. What it will restrict is how they operate, but not the access to the industry.
Okay, thank you. I hope that the regulations don't create a black market that we don't want.
Well, a black market is something that you cannot always totally eliminate, but the framework of the regulated industry is that it will provide sufficient access to everyone who legitimately wishes to access it without creating any unnecessary conditions, precedent, or hindrances for the access to that market.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen.
All right.
Yeah, good morning to all. Good morning.
Good morning.
Especially our panelists, Brother Dylan, Brother English, and Brother Emmanuel. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, my questions, I think I have about two questions. It is really in relation to employment. In what way that industry that will be established legal within that legal framework, in what way will that industry address our current level of employment in this country? Because knowing that if the industry is established and the amount based on previous calculations and current calculations that can be made out of this sustainable, it is called a sustainable industry. You understand? In what way will that actually positively impact in terms of reducing the level of employment?
Of
Unemployment, yeah. The other question, again, I believe it is attached to, might link it with the different tiers as far as the different tiers within the industry in terms of cultivation. It is hoped that, I believe that there will be some investors that will be interested within the industry. And within that industry with the investors, there will be a level whereby they might need people to work on the farms or whatever area as far as the industry is concerned. In terms of percentage, will it be something where the investors can come in with their own workers, or there will be a percentage of workers that he must come out with as far as the local people is concerned down here? The other question is, was there any linkages or any reference as far as the setting up that legal framework? Was there any consideration given to the Caribbean Regional Cannabis Report, of which that was shared by our Trinidadian friend, Professor Mirabel Antoine? Was there any linkages in references? Was there any study as far as that report is concerned? Because it is a Caribbean report, and I believe whatever we are doing, they might have some linkages in terms of what we do in that industry. Thank you very much.
All right. All right. So to answer your last question first, the 2018 CARICOM Cannabis report did inform the St. Lucia's cannabis policy, and the policy has informed the draft legislation. With regard to unemployment, we have existing co-industries, right? We have an agricultural sector. We have a framework. We have a normal national economy. What we're doing with cannabis is regularizing a product which was prohibited and mainstreaming it into the normal process of business and legal framework. Everything that currently exists will continue to exist and will now become applicable to cannabis. So in the context of unemployment, where unemployment may be a specific market failure, you may need certain regulations to deal with that market failure, to assist in that. But those regulations would also need to be flexible and responsive. And that is why we've not dealt with some of those types of things in the legislation, because the regulations which will come afterwards have to be able to respond to the changing dynamics. And if we operate in a manner which is too prescriptive, it will constrain our ability to grow. It will also constrain our ability to receive foreign direct investment into the industry. A lot of persons are looking forward to foreign direct investment, but I would posit that we have more local direct investment or local investment which is accessible, ready, willing, and waiting for the framework for the cannabis to commence. And we may see a lot more local investment than any foreign direct investment in the overall context. In terms of unemployment, you will have the industry is envisaged to be a value-added industry and not just simple raw materials. There's an aspect of raw materials, but there's also the value-added processing of cannabis oils, fiber, other products and byproducts, tinctures, creams, that create a brand new opening for employment in St. Lucia. It also see more manufacturing, more exports of specific value-added products. So we may not necessarily be exporting raw cannabis. It has taken other similar territories more than 3 years just to comply with the quality requirements and the documentation in order to export raw products. And so that is not something that we are excluding the export of raw products, but it may be quicker to deal with industrial cannabis. And industrial cannabis is where we believe that St. Lucia will have a competitive advantage in the short term, specifically if you look at the area of unemployment and the available skills in our marketplace to uptake into that sector.
I think Mr. Emmanuel is quite clear on that.
Yeah. My other question is again, in relation, because people will be displaced, hopefully. And my concern is in relation to the Rastafari community, still again. Well, again, I want to say I represent the Rastafari ICA and the Nyabingi House in St. Lucia. And those people who are actually those livelihoods, most probably that might shift in a different way, not as it is right now. What is in place in terms of addressing those livelihoods? Because there are some people actually, it will become a legal framework. But there are some people who actually they live by this cannabis. A holiday, a vacation in the States is cannabis dollars. The school books, the school uniform, whatever as far as the education of the children is concerned is the cannabis dollars. The clothes they wear, the doctor's visit is a cannabis dollar. So the real concern about how they will be dealt with in relation to that this livelihood, you know.
Okay. I'm happy you brought up that point because there was an omission on our end. The traditional cultivation license, which was been envisaged for the legislation, also permits a church or religious entity to apply for that traditional cultivation license, and that would thus facilitate the Rastafarian community, if they were to opt to get a license in the name of the community, to apply for the traditional cultivation license, as opposed to individuals doing so. That's one. And two, the Rastafarian community has formed part of the task force from its inception and formed part of the committee that was the precursor to this task force. So we've been taking instructions from the Rastafarian community for quite some time to ensure that the legislative regime does not pass them by. It is one of the reasons that though the legislation cannot allow for sacramental use based on the restrictions placed by the INCB, it's one of the reasons that use of cannabis within the confines of the house of worship of the Rastafarians is permitted, because we understand, based on our discussions with them, some of the difficulties that they face and some of the rights that we want to ensure form part and parcel of this regime.
Yeah. The other question and concern again is education. I'm very much concerned about education, because going from an illegal to a legal framework, there must be lots of education. Yeah. What is in place in terms of sensitizing the community in relation to this cannabis and the different changes? And are there other education methodologies apart from this panel discussion, hoping to come soon?
We will be having town hall meetings and other engagements throughout the communities, and that is specifically on the bill and how the new regime is envisaged. What we can tell you is that the majority of persons from our research who are using or who have used cannabis have been self-experimenting. Very few have had any specific reason to use cannabis. Now, that is what existed in the prohibited environment. Save for the Rastafarians who have a sacramental use and other persons who may have a medical reason, the education for us will be able to now because it's no longer a prohibited substance, and it's now a regulated substance, be able to dedicate resources to properly educate the population as to what is cannabis, how it should be used, what are the benefits of cannabis, what are the restrictions of cannabis, what are the prohibitions with regard to cannabis. And that is part of what we consider this major societal shift. Currently, there is no legal state mechanism to educate anyone with regard to cannabis.
The reason why I asked the question, because I'm also I do some kind of chaplaincy work at Bodily. The question has been asked by the inmates or the residents of Bodily, and I need information. So here's the reason why I have to be well equipped as far as information is concerned.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I want to say, well, I give thanks to the Almighty for a good work well done. A job well done by the Cannabis Task Force.
Thank you.
Yeah, good representation, right through.
Yeah. Thank you.
Blessed Lord.
Thank you to our panelists, Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis and Mr. Vini Manuel, for participating in today's panel discussion, and also thank you to the St. Lucia Cannabis Task Force. I want to wish everyone a pleasant day, and thank you very much for attending our discussion today.
Thank you.
The panel, the discussion, an objective and impartial view of the issues of interest to you. Nation Beat is on now.